You think you can talk your way out of this? You're not in charge here.
I am.
This is not about being in charge. This is about common sense and respect, and you are showing neither.
That's it! He's resisting!
The afternoon sun of late spring in the city of Oak Ridge was a gentle, warming presence, the kind that coaxed residents from their homes and onto the tree-lined sidewalks. It was a day for walking dogs, for children's laughter to echo from front yards, for the mundane and beautiful rhythm of neighborhood life. For Richard Allen, it was a day of quiet satisfaction. At 50 years old, he had cultivated a life as rooted and steady as the old oaks that gave the city its name. He stood on the curb of Maple Avenue, his hands resting on his hips, a faint smile playing on his lips. Before him, the community garden he had championed for the better part of a decade was a riot of color and life. Tomato vines, heavy with green fruit, climbed their stakes, and the deep purple of eggplant peeked from beneath broad leaves. This small plot of land, once a derelict, litter-strewn lot, was Richard's proudest achievement. He wasn't a politician or a wealthy philanthropist. He was a former high school history teacher who had seen a need and decided, quite simply, to fill it. He had organized the fundraisers, navigated the city's bureaucracy, and rallied the volunteers. Now, families from 3 different neighborhoods came here to grow their own food, to connect with the earth and with each other. It was a tangible piece of the community he had spent his life building. His gaze drifted from the garden to the gleaming black Lincoln Navigator parked at the curb just ahead of him. The vehicle belonged to one of the garden's most generous donors, a real estate developer named Marcus Thorne. Marcus had let him borrow the SUV for the day to transport a large donation of gardening tools and bags of topsoil from a nursery on the other side of town. The key fob felt heavy and foreign in the pocket of his worn denim jeans. Richard was more of a 10-year-old sedan kind of man, but he couldn't deny the utility of the cavernous vehicle. He had just finished unloading the last of the bags and was taking a moment to stretch his back, admiring the fruits of his labor, both the garden's and his own. He was contemplating the simple pleasure of a cold glass of iced tea when the seamless tranquility of the afternoon was torn by the crunch of tires pulling up sharply behind him. A white and blue Oak Ridge Police Department patrol car had materialized, its arrival swift and silent until the final moment. Richard felt a familiar, low-level prickle of awareness, the ingrained caution that every black man in America learns to live with. He didn't turn immediately, instead making a deliberate show of wiping a smudge of dirt from his hands onto his jeans, a calm, non-threatening gesture. The car doors opened and closed in rapid succession. The sounds of heavy boots on asphalt grew closer. Richard finally turned, his expression neutral, his hands kept carefully in sight. 3 officers were approaching him, fanned out in a classic tactical formation. 2 were white, 1 was Hispanic. The one in the lead, the clear alpha of the trio, was young, probably not yet 30, with a military-style haircut and a jaw that seemed permanently clenched. His name tag read Kincaid. His eyes, shaded by mirrored sunglasses, were fixed on Richard with an unnerving intensity. The other 2, Wallace and Young, hung back slightly, their postures mirroring their leaders but lacking his aggressive edge. "Good afternoon, officers," Richard said, his voice even and calm. It was the voice of a teacher, measured and accustomed to de-escalation. "Something I can help you with?" Kincaid stopped about 6 feet away, his hand resting casually, almost performatively, on the butt of his holstered sidearm. He ignored Richard's greeting entirely. His gaze flicked from Richard to the luxury SUV and back to Richard. The calculus happening behind the sunglasses was as obvious as it was insulting. "This your vehicle?" Kincaid asked. The question was not a question. It was an accusation. "It is for today," Richard answered politely. I borrowed it from a friend to move some supplies for the community garden. He gestured with an open hand toward the vibrant plot of land. Just finished unloading. In fact, Kincaid's lips tightened into a smirk that didn't touch his eyes. Borrowed it from a friend, he repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the warm air like an insult. Right. We got a call about a suspicious individual casing a high-end vehicle in this area. Matches your description. Richard felt a cold knot form in his stomach, a stark contrast to the sun's warmth on his skin. He had lived on this street for 20 years. His neighbors were waving at him from their porches just moments ago. He had been a fixture in this community, a leader, a mentor. And now, in the space of 30 seconds, he was a suspicious individual. He kept his composure, the years of navigating subtle and overt aggressions, providing a deep well of patience to draw from. Officer, I can assure you there's been a misunderstanding, Richard said, keeping his tone reasonable. My name is Richard Allen. I live just 2 blocks over on Elm Street. The man who owns this car is Marcus Thorne. I'd be happy to give you his number so you can clear this all up. Kincaid took another step forward, closing the distance between them. The air crackled with a sudden, oppressive tension. Wallace and Young shifted their weight, their eyes darting around the quiet street as if expecting a threat to emerge from the manicured lawns. I think, Kincaid said, his voice low and laced with a grating condescension, that you're going to put your hands on your head. We need to figure out what's really going on here. The casual command, so utterly disconnected from the reality of the situation, struck Richard with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This wasn't about a suspicious person call, which he was certain had never been made. This was about the simple, ugly fact that he was a 50-year-old black man in jeans and a T-shirt standing next to a $70,000 SUV. In Officer Kincaid's world, that equation only had one possible answer. And Richard knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the calm, rational world he had inhabited his entire life was about to be turned upside down. The demand to put your hands on your head was not a suggestion. It was a tactical command, a verbal tool designed to seize control and force submission. Richard Allen understood this. He also understood that compliance, in this specific context, was an admission of guilt he did not possess. To follow the order would be to accept the false premise of the entire encounter, that he was a threat, a suspect, a nail that needed to be hammered down. He held his ground, his feet planted firmly on the asphalt. His hands remained at his sides, open and visible. Officer, with all due respect, I haven't done anything wrong, Richard stated, his voice a low, steady anchor in the rising tide of aggression. I'm not a threat to you. I'm just trying to explain the situation. Officer Kincaid's jaw tightened even further. The slight challenge, the refusal to immediately bend to his will, was like a spark on dry tinder. His entire posture radiated a bruised authority. He saw a man who wasn't afraid of him, and he couldn't tolerate it. Sir, I gave you a lawful order, Kincaid said, his voice taking on a harder, more menacing edge. You're failing to comply? That's called obstruction. Now, I'm not going to ask you again. The other 2 officers, Wallace and Young, shifted uncomfortably. Wallace, older than Kincaid by a few years, but clearly his subordinate in attitude, mirrored his leader's aggressive stance, placing his hand on his own weapon. Young, the youngest of the 3, looked conflicted. His eyes darted from his senior officer to Richard, then to the peaceful garden, then to the neighbors who were beginning to emerge onto their porches, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. He could see the disconnect between the supposed threat and the reality of the scene. Richard decided to try a different approach, appealing to logic, to the shared reality he hoped still existed. "Let's just slow this down for a moment," he said, using the same calming tone he'd once used on volatile teenagers in the school hallways. "You said you got a call. Can you tell me what the description of the suspicious person was?" "It was a man fitting your description, acting suspiciously around this vehicle," Kincaid snapped back, the circular logic infuriating. "And what was I doing that was suspicious?" Richard pressed, genuinely wanting to understand the twisted reasoning at play. "I was unloading bags of soil. The doors were unlocked with a key fob. I wasn't looking in windows or trying door handles. I was working." "That's for us to determine," Kincaid retorted, dismissing Richard's explanation as if it were irrelevant. "The fact is, you're being uncooperative. That makes you more suspicious." It was a maddening, impossible trap. His very attempt to prove his innocence was being used as evidence of his guilt. The frustration was a hot, coiling thing in his chest, but he refused to let it show. He had seen situations like this escalate on the news, in videos shared across social media. He knew that anger, however justified, would be twisted into aggression and used as a pretext for violence. His only weapon was his composure. "I am not trying to be uncooperative," Richard said, enunciating each word with deliberate clarity. "I am trying to have a conversation. I have offered to provide the owner's contact information. My driver's license, which has my local address, is in my back pocket. I am willing to show it to you. But I am not going to put my hands on my head and be treated like a criminal when I am standing in my own community, doing work for that community." He directed his next words past Kincaid, toward Officer Young, whose unease was now palpable. "Officer, does this seem right to you? You're looking at a community garden. You see the bags of soil I just unloaded. You see a man who is calmly and respectfully trying to answer your questions. Is there any part of this that suggests a crime is in progress?" Young flinched, caught in the older man's direct appeal. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but a sharp look from Kincaid silenced him. The moment of potential reason was gone, crushed by the rigid chain of command. Kincaid stepped directly into Richard's personal space, his face now inches from Richard's. The smell of cheap aftershave and raw power was suffocating. "Are you trying to tell me how to do my job? You think you can talk your way out of this?" he hissed, his voice a low growl. "You're not in charge here. I am." The shift was complete. This was no longer about a suspicious vehicle or a non-existent 911 call. It had become a raw contest of wills. It was about Kincaid's need to dominate, to enforce a hierarchy in which his uniform placed him at the absolute top. And any failure by Richard to acknowledge that hierarchy was an intolerable offense. Richard could see the precipice now, the line they were about to cross. He had done everything right. He had been polite, rational, and transparent, but none of it mattered. "This is not about being in charge," Richard said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, imbued with a final, somber warning. "This is about common sense and respect, and you are showing neither." The words, though spoken quietly, struck Kincaid like a physical slap. The insult wasn't the volume, but the truth of it. It was a direct challenge to his authority, to his very sense of self as an officer. The mirrored sunglasses reflected a distorted image of Richard's face, but in them, Richard saw the officer's decision. The small flicker of reason that might have existed in the man was extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "That's it. You're done," Kincaid declared, his voice booming across the now silent street. He turned his head slightly. "Wallace, Young, move in. He's resisting." The word resisting was a lie, a piece of procedural magic to justify what was about to happen. Richard wasn't resisting. He was standing still. He was existing. But in Kincaid's world, his very existence as a man who would not be cowed was a form of resistance. As officers Wallace and Young moved to flank him, their hands reaching for his arms, Richard Allen steeled himself. The confrontation of words was over. A new, more brutal one was about to begin. The world seemed to contract into a tight, focused bubble of action. The peripheral sounds of the neighborhood, a distant lawnmower, the barking of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the oak trees, faded into a dull hum. All that remained was the immediate physical reality of the three officers closing in. Richard didn't brace or flinch. He made a conscious decision to remain perfectly still, to offer no physical pretext, no justification for the force he knew was coming. His body became a silent testament to the injustice of the moment. Officer Wallace, the follower, was the first to make contact. His hand, thick and meaty, clamped down on Richard's left bicep. The grip was unnecessarily tight, a grip meant to control a violent suspect, not a 50-year-old man standing passively on a sidewalk. Simultaneously, Officer Young hesitated for a fraction of a second, his movements less certain, before taking Richard's right arm. Young's touch was firmer than it needed to be, but it lacked the vindictive pressure of his colleagues. "I am not resisting," Richard said, his voice clear and steady, projecting for the benefit of the neighbors who were now watching from their porches and front windows, their faces etched with confusion and concern. Mrs. Gable, a sweet, elderly woman who often brought lemonade to the garden volunteers, had her hand over her mouth in shock. The Johnson brothers, two teenagers Richard had mentored, stood frozen by their bicycles on the opposite side of the street. Officer Kincaid ignored his statement. He was the conductor of this ugly symphony. "Get his hands behind his back," he commanded, his voice ringing with a triumphant finality. Wallace and Young began to wrench Richard's arms behind him. It was an awkward, painful maneuver. Richard was not a small man, and the years of physical work in the garden and around his home had kept him strong. The officers struggled for a moment, their exertion a clear indication of the non-compliance they would later claim in their reports. But it wasn't a struggle of resistance. It was the simple, uncooperative physics of a body not assisting in its own subjugation. The cold, unforgiving bite of steel encircled his right wrist. The sharp, click-clack-click of the handcuff ratchet tightening was a sound of absolute finality. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on reason, on dialogue, on his status as a respected member of the community. In that instant, he was stripped of his identity, teacher, mentor, neighbor, and remade into the only thing Kincaid could see, a perpetrator. As the second cuff was secured, Kincaid stepped forward to perform the perfunctory pat-down. His hands moved over Richard's body with a rough, impersonal intimacy that was profoundly violating. He pulled Richard's wallet from his back pocket and the key fob for the SUV from his front pocket. He held them up as if they were trophies. "Look at that," Kincaid said, his voice dripping with mock discovery as he opened the wallet. "Richard Allen, lives right here in the neighborhood, and a set of keys to a brand-new Lincoln. What do you know?" The sarcasm was thick, intended not for his fellow officers, but for the watching neighbors, an attempt to posthumously justify his actions. The humiliation was a burning fire in Richard's chest. He was being paraded, cuffed and powerless, in front of the very people who looked up to him. He could feel their eyes on him, a mixture of pity, fear, and outrage. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a deliberate degradation, a public stripping of his dignity. As Kincaid steered him by the arm toward the patrol car, Richard caught Officer Young's eye. The young man's face was a canvas of conflict. He wouldn't meet Richard's gaze for more than a second, his eyes quickly darting away to the pavement, to the door of the patrol car, anywhere else. In that flicker of eye contact, Richard saw a glimmer of shame. It wasn't enough to make him act, but it was there. Young knew this was wrong. He knew he was a party to an injustice, and the knowledge was a poison he would have to live with. The back of the patrol car was an oven. The black plastic was hot against his skin, and the air was thick with the stale smell of disinfectant and human misery. Kincaid pushed him onto the seat unceremoniously, his hand firm in the center of Richard's back. The door slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud, sealing him inside the cage. Through the wire mesh of the partition, he watched the scene play out like a silent, distorted film. He saw Kincaid speaking to a few of the neighbors, his gestures broad and dismissive, no doubt spinning his tale of a non-compliant suspect and a situation brought safely under control. He saw Marcus Thorne, the owner of the SUV, pull up in another car, summoned by a frantic phone call from one of the neighbors. He watched Marcus, a powerful and influential man, argue with Kincaid, his face turning red with fury, pointing from Richard in the back of the car to the garden and back again. It made no difference. The machine was in motion. In the suffocating heat of the car, the initial shock began to recede, replaced by something colder, harder, and infinitely more durable. A profound, crystalline resolve began to form in the pit of his stomach. He had spent his life believing in the power of dialogue, of community, of building bridges. He taught his students that the system, for all its flaws, could be reasoned with, could be improved from within. He had believed in the fundamental promise of fairness. The click of those handcuffs had shattered that belief. The system hadn't failed. It had performed exactly as designed. Officer Kincaid was not an anomaly. He was a product of that system, a system that empowered his biases, protected his ego, and gave him a weapon and a badge to enforce his own petty tyrannies. Richard leaned his head back against the hard plastic partition and closed his eyes. The rage was there, a white-hot furnace deep inside him, but he would not let it consume him. He began to cool it, to bank it, to forge it into something else. Vengeance was too small, too personal. A lawsuit would punish these three officers, would win him a financial settlement, but it wouldn't change the underlying rot. It wouldn't stop the next Officer Kincaid from doing the same thing to another man on another sunlit street. No, this could not end with him. This had to be bigger. As the patrol car finally pulled away from the curb, leaving his community, his garden, and his life in its wake. Richard Allen made a silent vow. They thought they had just arrested a car thief. They were wrong. They had just arrested a man who would now dedicate his life to dismantling the very system that had put him in those cuffs. They had made a grave mistake. They had not created a victim. They had created an adversary. The drive to the central booking station was a journey into another world, a transition from the familiar sunlit streets of his own neighborhood to the cold, institutional heart of the city's justice system. The world outside the patrol car's window became a blur of anonymous buildings and indifferent faces. Inside the car, the silence was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the police radio, a litany of codes and locations that felt like a secret language from a parallel universe. Richard focused on his breathing, a slow, meditative rhythm that kept the fire of his anger banked and under control. This was a time for observation, for gathering data. He was no longer just a participant in this nightmare, he was a student of it. The Sally Port of the Oak Ridge pretrial detention facility was a grim cavern of concrete and steel. The heavy garage door rumbled shut behind the patrol car, the sound echoing with an oppressive finality. The temperature dropped instantly. The air was cold, recycled, and carried the faint, acrid smell of industrial cleaner and human despair. Officer Kincaid led him out of the car. His hand once again clamped on Richard's arm, steering him through a series of buzzing, electronically locked doors as if he were a dangerous felon. The booking area was a large, open room humming with a low-grade, chaotic energy. Phones rang, keyboards clattered, and officers spoke in loud, jaded tones. It was a factory floor for processing human beings. Richard's arrival caused a momentary lull in the activity. Heads turned, eyes lingered on his cuffed hands, on the dirt smudges on his jeans, on the quiet dignity of his expression, which seemed so out of place in this environment. A cuffed man in his 50s who carried himself not with the furtive shame of a criminal, but with the stony resolve of a man wronged, was an anomaly. Kincaid pushed him toward a high counter presided over by a heavy-set, world-weary desk sergeant with a nameplate that read Donovan. Donovan looked up from his paperwork, his gaze flat and unimpressed. He had seen it all, and Kincaid's puffed-up demeanor clearly didn't register. "Got a live one for you." "Sarge," Kincaid announced, his voice unnecessarily loud. "Resisting without violence and obstruction of a police investigation." Donovan's gaze drifted from Kincaid to Richard. He took in the older man's face, the steadiness in his eyes. He slowly raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Resisting what? Kincaid? A lecture on gardening?" He gestured vaguely at Richard's clothes. "What's the story?" Subject was casing a Lincoln Navigator on Maple Avenue. Became belligerent and uncooperative when questioned. Refused to follow lawful orders, Kincaid recited. The official narrative already polished and ready for the report. "My name is Richard Allen," Richard interjected, his voice calm but firm, cutting through Kincaid's performance. "I was unloading soil for the Maple Avenue Community Garden. The vehicle was loaned to me for that purpose. I offered to provide the officers with all of my identification and the owner's contact information. I simply refused to be treated like a criminal for doing nothing wrong." Sergeant Donovan's eyes narrowed slightly. He had been a cop for 25 years. He could smell a flimsy arrest report from across the room. And this one reeked. He had heard the name Richard Allen before, the guy from the papers, the one who organized those youth programs, the one who got that garden built. This wasn't some random street tough. "You're telling me you arrested Richard Allen for unloading dirt?" Donovan asked Kincaid, his voice flat but laced with a clear undercurrent of disbelief. "I arrested him for obstruction," Kincaid insisted, his confidence wavering slightly under the veteran sergeant's scrutiny. "The investigation is ongoing." Donovan let out a slow, weary sigh and shook his head. He had seen too many young cops like Kincaid, officers who confused their authority with absolute power and saw any challenge, no matter how reasonable, as a personal affront. It was a personality flaw that created mountains of paperwork and costly lawsuits. "Whatever," he grumbled, turning to the booking officer. "Process him." The booking process was a systematic ritual of dehumanization. Richard was photographed, the flash of the mugshot camera capturing his exhausted but unbroken expression. His fingerprints were taken, the black ink feeling like a stain on his skin, a physical mark of the state's brand. He was instructed to remove his shoelaces and his belt, small, symbolic acts of rendering a person powerless. He surrendered the contents of his pockets, his wallet, his keys, a stray seed packet, and a folded, well-read copy of the U.S. Constitution he often carried. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. The very document that was supposed to protect him from this kind of overreach was now being logged as a personal effect. Another piece of evidence in the case against him. The officer handling the inventory, a young man who looked barely out of his teens, handled Richard's belongings with a surprising gentleness. "Mr. Allen?" he asked, looking up from Richard's driver's license. "You're the guy who used to teach history at Northwood High, right? I was in your 11th grade class. Mr. Peterson! Richard looked at the young officer, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He remembered a quiet, thoughtful kid who sat in the back row. Peterson, Richard said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. I remember. I hope you learned something. The young officer flushed, a deep wave of discomfort washing over his face. I did, sir, he mumbled, unable to meet Richard's eyes. I'm sorry, sir, about this. It's not your fault, son, Richard said quietly. You just do your job. The brief moment of human connection was a small island in an ocean of institutional indifference. After the paperwork was complete, Officer Peterson led him down a sterile corridor to a holding cell. The heavy steel door slid open with a hydraulic hiss. The cell was a small concrete box containing only a steel bench and a toilet. It was cold, brutally simple, and smelled of bleach and regret. It shouldn't be long, Peterson said apologetically. Once the sergeant talks to the DIA, they'll probably kick this. The door slammed shut. The heavy thump of the magnetic lock engaging echoed in the small space. For the first time, Richard was completely alone. He sat down on the cold steel bench, the chill seeping through his jeans. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the confrontation and the arrest began to drain away, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. He looked at his hands, the hands that had tilled soil, graded papers, and shaken the hands of mayors and congressmen. Now they were the hands of a prisoner. He had dedicated his life to the idea of civil society, to the belief that common decency and shared values were the glue that held everything together. In the space of an hour, he had been shown the terrifying fragility of that idea. He had seen how quickly the rules could be rewritten, how easily a man's life and liberty could be subject to the whims of another man's ego. This cell was more than just a room. It was a classroom, and Richard Allen was learning a lesson he would never forget. He wasn't just going to fight this. He was going to change the curriculum. Time in a holding cell is a strange, distorted thing. It stretches and compresses, marked only by the muffled sounds of the station outside and the shifting patterns of light from the corridor. Richard spent the hours not in despair, but in deep, focused thought. He mentally replayed the encounter with Kincaid, not with anger, but with the analytical detachment of a historian studying a primary source. He dissected the officer's language, his posture, the subtle power dynamics at play with his subordinates. He saw it not just as a personal attack, but as a case study in a systemic pathology. This was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a disease. It was nearly dusk when he heard the distinct sound of dress shoes approaching his cell, a sharp contrast to the heavy thud of police boots. A guard appeared, followed by a woman in a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit. She was in her late 40s, with a commanding presence, intelligent eyes, and a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen the inside of many courtrooms. "Richard Allen?" she asked, her voice crisp and confident. Richard stood up. My name is Evelyn Reed," she said, offering a small, professional smile. "I'm an attorney. Marcus Thorne and about half of your neighborhood have been burning up my phone lines for the past 3 hours. They retained me on your behalf. Don't worry. We're about to get you out of here." A wave of relief washed over Richard, not just for the prospect of freedom, but for the validation of his community's support. He wasn't alone. True to her word, within 30 minutes, the cell door was sliding open. The charges of resisting and obstruction, as Sergeant Donovan had predicted, had evaporated upon contact with the district attorney's office. There was no case, no evidence, nothing but the flimsy, ego-driven report of an overzealous officer. As he was handed back his personal effects, his belt, his shoelaces, his well-worn copy of the Constitution, Evelyn Reed was already outlining the next steps. The release is unconditional, but this is far from over, she said as they walked out of the station and into the cool evening air. The freedom was intoxicating. They made a colossal mistake. Richard, a mistake they are going to pay for dearly. They drove to her office, a sleek, modern space in a downtown high-rise that felt like a different universe from the grit and despair of the holding cell. For the next hour, Richard recounted the entire event in meticulous detail. While Evelyn listened, her pen flying across a legal pad, she would occasionally interrupt with a sharp, clarifying question. Did he ever articulate what specific action of yours was suspicious? No, just that I was there. Did he identify himself by name and badge number before issuing commands? No, he went straight to accusation. And there were multiple witnesses, neighbors, the owner of the vehicle, at least a dozen. When he was finished, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. Richard, she began, her tone shifting from fact-gathering to strategic planning. I've been a civil rights attorney for 20 years. I've handled dozens of wrongful arrest cases. I can tell you, without any hyperbole, that this is one of the cleanest, most egregious cases I have ever seen. She stood up and began to pace, her energy filling the room. Let me paint a picture for you. We have a beloved community leader, a man with unimpeachable character. We have him engaged in a charitable act in broad daylight. We have 3 police officers, led by one with a clear temper problem, initiating a confrontation with no probable cause. We have a clear pattern of escalation on their part, and a consistent attempt at de-escalation on yours. We have the entire thing witnessed by a dozen credible middle-class homeowners who are all outraged. And the cherry on top? The suspect they arrested for trying to steal a $70,000 car is best friends with the man who owns it. She stopped and looked at him, her eyes gleaming. This isn't a lawsuit. Richard, this is a public execution. The city's lawyers will see the witness list and they will immediately know they have no defense. They will not let this see the inside of a courtroom. She walked back to her desk and sat down, leaning forward conspiratorially. Here's what's going to happen. I am going to file a federal lawsuit citing a violation of your Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable seizure and your First Amendment right to be free from retaliatory arrest. We will sue Officer Kincaid, Wallace, and Young individually, and the city of Oak Ridge for failure to train and supervise its officers. We won't ask for a specific number. We'll let their imaginations run wild. Her voice dropped, becoming more serious. They'll come to the table fast. They'll want to settle. We will not take their first offer or their second. We will push, based on my experience with similar cases. We are looking at a settlement in the range of $1.5 to $2 million, tax-free. The number hung in the air, so vast it seemed unreal. $2 million. It was a sum that could change a person's life. It could pay off his mortgage, fund the community garden for a century, allow him to retire and dedicate his life to his passions without a single financial care. It was the price of his humiliation. It was an offer of vindication, of retribution, of a profound and satisfying victory. It was a chance to make Kincaid and the city that employed him regret the moment they ever laid eyes on him. This is their worst nightmare, Evelyn continued, sensing his silence. A perfect plaintiff, a terrible set of facts, and a media firestorm waiting to happen. We can make them pay. We can get you justice. Richard, and we can make you a very wealthy man in the process. She slid a retainer agreement across the polished surface of the desk. All he had to do was sign. It was a clear path forward, a righteous and lucrative crusade. He could take the money, heal his wounds, and walk away, his dignity restored and his future secured. It was the logical choice. It was the American way. Take a wrong and turn it into a windfall. But as Richard stared at the pen Evelyn offered him, he wasn't thinking about the money. He was thinking about the cold steel of the cell bench. He was thinking about the shame in young Officer Peterson's eyes. He was thinking about the systemic disease and how a multi-million-dollar payout was not a cure. It was just a painkiller. And Richard Allen had never been interested in treating the symptoms. He wanted to eradicate the disease. Richard looked from the pen to Evelyn Reed's expectant face. She saw a slam-dunk case, a righteous victory, and a substantial payday for them both. He saw something entirely different. He saw a bandage being offered for a mortal wound. He gently pushed the retainer agreement back across the desk. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the weight of a gavel. Evelyn blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Her perfectly crafted pitch had hit an unexpected wall. "No," she repeated, a hint of confusion in her voice. "Richard, I think you might be underestimating the strength of our position. We have them completely cornered. This isn't a gamble. It's a certainty." "Oh, I don't doubt for a second that you could win," Richard clarified, leaning forward and steepling his fingers. "And I appreciate your expertise and your passion more than you know. But you and I have a different definition of winning." He paused, gathering his thoughts, the amorphous resolve that had formed in the holding cell now crystallizing into a clear, sharp philosophy. "Let's say we do this. We sue. The city, terrified of the bad press, settles for $2 million. What happens then? I'm rich. Yes. My humiliation is monetized. Officer Kincaid might get a suspension, maybe even fired if the media pressure is strong enough. Wallace and Young get a slap on the wrist. The city pays the settlement out of an insurance fund. Their lawyers write it off as the cost of doing business, and they go on with their day." He looked directly into her eyes, his gaze intense. "But what has fundamentally changed? Evelyn, a year from now, will the Oak Ridge Police Department have better training? Will there be a system in place to identify and remove officers like Kincaid before they ruin someone's life? Will the next man, who doesn't have a powerful friend like Marcus Thorne or a neighborhood of witnesses, be treated any differently?" The answer is no. Nothing will have changed. The system that produced this outcome will remain perfectly intact. My silence and satisfaction will have been purchased for $2 million. Evelyn was silent, her sharp legal mind processing his argument. She was accustomed to clients who wanted retribution, who wanted to be made whole. The idea of a client who saw his personal injury as a mere symptom of a larger societal illness was a novel concept. "This was never about me," Richard continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction. "When I was sitting in that cell, I realized something. This happened to me, but it's not about me. It's about the Sergeant Donovans who are too weary to fight the tide of bad policing. It's about the Officer Youngs who know something is wrong, but are too afraid of the blue wall of silence to speak up. It's about a culture that allows an officer's bruised ego to be a more protected entity than a citizen's constitutional rights." He stood up and walked to the large window overlooking the city lights. The view from this office was one of power, of order, of a system functioning as it should. But he had just spent 3 hours in the engine room of that system, and he knew the truth was far messier. "I don't want their money," he said, turning back to face her. "I want to change their rules. I don't want to sue them for what they did. I want to build something that prevents them from ever being able to do it again." Evelyn stared at him, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. This wasn't a client in shock. This was a man with a mission. "What are you proposing?" she asked, her curiosity genuinely piqued. "You can't change a system without leverage. This lawsuit is your leverage." "Exactly," Richard agreed. But we're not going to use it to get a payout. We're going to use it to get a seat at the table. We are going to file the lawsuit, just as you said, but we are also going to go public. We're going to hold a press conference. We're going to organize a town hall meeting. We're going to find every other person in this city who has a story about being mistreated by the OPD. We're going to use the threat of this perfect, unwinnable lawsuit not to demand a check, but to demand a conversation, a real, public, an uncomfortable conversation about police reform. He was thinking on his feet now, the ideas flowing, the history teacher in him building a lesson plan for the entire city. We're going to demand civilian oversight. We're going to demand changes to the use of force policy. We're going to demand independent investigations and a complete overhaul of the citizen complaint process. We're going to demand real, systemic change. A slow smile spread across Evelyn Reed's face. The cynicism that had been her armor for 2 decades of legal battles began to melt away, replaced by a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: inspiration. This was bigger than a settlement. This was bigger than a single case. This was the kind of fight that could define a career, that could actually leave the world a better place. It was risky, unconventional, and had a much lower chance of a financial win. But the potential for a true victory was immeasurable. "Richard," she said, her voice filled with a newfound respect, "this is a much harder fight. They will fight you with everything they have. They will try to destroy your reputation. They will call you anti-police, a radical. It will be a long, ugly, and very public war." "I know," Richard said simply, his expression serene. "I taught American history. Evelyn, every single step of progress this country has ever made was a long, ugly, and public war. Why should this be any different?" He walked back to the desk and looked down at the unsigned retainer. "I'm not your typical client, and this isn't your typical case. The question is, are you the right kind of lawyer?" Evelyn Reed picked up the pen, but she didn't offer it to him. She clicked it open, and on a fresh page of her legal pad, she wrote at the top, "The Oak Ridge Community Safety and Accountability Initiative." She underlined it twice. "Richard Allen," she said, looking up at him with a fire in her eyes. "Let's go to war." The decision to forego a personal fortune in favor of a systemic fight transformed Richard's ordeal from a private grievance into a public cause. The first step was to seize control of the narrative. Officer Kincaid and the Oak Ridge Police Department had their version of events. A sterile and misleading report filed away in an evidence locker. Richard was about to counter with something far more powerful: the truth, amplified by the voices of the community. With Evelyn Reed handling the legal maneuvering, filing the initial lawsuit to act as a looming threat, Richard focused on what he did best: community organizing. He didn't call a press conference at the steps of City Hall. That would have been confrontational, playing into the stereotype of the angry activist the police would inevitably try to paint him as. Instead, he chose a different venue: the basement of the First Presbyterian Church, the same space where the Community Garden Committee held its weekly meetings. It was neutral ground, a place associated with potlucks and bake sales, not political uprisings. The invitations went out not through the media, but through neighborhood email lists, church bulletins, and flyers posted at the local library and grocery store. The event was billed simply as a community conversation on public safety. There was no mention of lawsuits or police brutality. The language was deliberately inclusive and non-threatening. On the evening of the town hall, a week after his arrest, Richard stood at the entrance to the church basement, his heart pounding. He had no idea what to expect. Would anyone come? Would they see this as his personal problem, or would they understand the broader implications? The first to arrive were his immediate neighbors, the familiar, friendly faces from Maple Avenue, led by the indomitable Mrs. Gable, who brought a large platter of cookies. Then came the families from the community garden, carrying signs that read, "We stand with Richard." Then others began to trickle in, people he didn't know. A young mother pushing a stroller, a retired union plumber, a group of college students, a well-dressed couple from the wealthier side of town. The trickle became a stream, and the stream became a flood. By the time the meeting was scheduled to start, the church basement was packed. Over 200 people filled the folding chairs, stood along the walls, and spilled out into the hallway. The air was thick with a palpable energy, a mixture of anger, curiosity, and a desperate hope for a voice. Richard walked to the simple wooden lectern at the front of the room. He didn't begin with his own story. He began by thanking them for coming, for caring about their community. Then, he opened the floor. "I'm here tonight because I had an experience that made me question the relationship between our community and those sworn to protect it," he said, his voice calm and steady. "But I know I'm not the only one. Before I tell you what happened to me, I want to hear from you. Who else has a story they've been waiting to tell?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, a hesitant hand went up in the back. A middle-aged woman named Sarah Jenkins, a local accountant, stood up. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Last year," she began, "my son was pulled over for having a broken taillight. He's a good kid, honor roll student. The officer had him get out of the car, emptied his backpack all over the hood in the rain, treated him like a drug dealer. My son was so humiliated he didn't want to drive for a month. We filed a complaint. We never heard a word back." As she finished, a murmur of empathy rippled through the crowd. Her story broke the dam. Another hand went up. A young man spoke about being stopped and frisked repeatedly while walking home from his night shift at a restaurant. An elderly gentleman described an officer being rude and dismissive when he called to report a break-in. A business owner recounted a story of police harassment during a routine inspection. Story after story tumbled out, a cascade of frustration and quiet indignities that had been simmering beneath the surface of the city's placid exterior for years. These weren't stories of overt, headline-grabbing violence. They were stories of disrespect, of abuse of power, of a police force that viewed the citizens it served not as partners, but as a population to be managed and controlled. They were stories of complaints that vanished into a bureaucratic black hole, of a system with no accountability. Finally, after nearly an hour of listening, Richard told his own story. He recounted the events of that sunny afternoon with the same calm precision he had used with Evelyn. He didn't embellish or editorialize. He simply laid out the facts. By the time he described the cold click of the handcuffs, the room was utterly silent, hanging on his every word. The shared experience of the previous hour had given his personal story a universal weight. It was no longer just his humiliation, it was theirs. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident," he concluded, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. It was the predictable outcome of a broken system, a system without meaningful civilian oversight, without transparent disciplinary procedures, and without a culture of accountability. They tell us to file complaints, but the complaints disappear. They tell us these are just a few bad apples, but they do nothing to inspect the barrel. He looked out at the sea of faces, no longer just a collection of individuals, but the foundation of a movement. They expect us to be silent. They expect us to be afraid. They expect us to take the money and go away. Well, I am here tonight to say that we will not be silent. We are not afraid, and we are not for sale. The church basement erupted. The applause was a thunderous roar, a release of years of pent-up frustration. It was more than just support for him. It was a collective roar of defiance. In that moment, Richard Allen ceased to be a victim. He had taken his personal pain and transformed it into a shared public purpose. He had ignited a spark, and in the faces of his neighbors, he saw the promise of a cleansing fire. The fight was no longer his alone. It now belonged to the entire city of Oak Ridge. The community meeting in the church basement was a profound success, but it also acted as a seismic event that sent shockwaves directly to the two epicenters of power in Oak Ridge, the mayor's office and the headquarters of the Oak Ridge Police Department. Richard and Evelyn had successfully bypassed the traditional media and created a grassroots groundswell that the city could not ignore. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. The reaction was swift and predictable. The city's power structure, which had hoped to quietly resolve the Richard Allen problem with a check, was now faced with a burgeoning political movement. Their first move was a classic divide-and-conquer strategy, orchestrated by the man who personified the old guard of Oak Ridge law enforcement, Police Chief Michael Morrison. Chief Morrison was a man in his late 50s who looked like he had been born in a police uniform. He had a square jaw, a full head of silver hair, and a public persona that was carefully cultivated to project an image of calm, steady, no-nonsense leadership. He was a master of the political game, adept at managing city council, placating the media, and, above all, protecting his department and his officers from any and all outside scrutiny. To him, Richard Allen's nascent movement was not a call for reform. It was a declaration of war. His opening salvo was not aimed at Richard directly. It was aimed at the public's fear. Morrison held a press conference, flanked by the grim-faced president of the Oak Ridge Police Union, a bulldog of a man named Frank Rizzo. The backdrop was a large screen displaying rising crime statistics, cherry-picked data on burglaries and car thefts that, when presented without context, painted a picture of a city under siege. In these challenging times, Morrison began, his voice grave and paternal. The brave men and women of the Oak Ridge Police Department are the thin blue line that stands between order and chaos. They put their lives on the line every single day to keep your families safe. And yet, there are forces in our city, well-intentioned perhaps, but dangerously naive, who seek to undermine our officers, to tie their hands, and to second-guess every split-second decision they make in the field. He never said Richard's name, but he didn't have to. The target was clear. "This is not a time for division," Morrison continued, his voice rising with practiced passion. "This is a time to support our police. This new, radical, anti-police rhetoric that is sweeping our city is not just an attack on law enforcement. It's an attack on the safety and security of every citizen in Oak Ridge. It emboldens criminals and makes our officers hesitate. And that hesitation can be fatal." Frank Rizzo, the union president, was more blunt. "Let me be clear," he growled into the microphone. "My officers are being vilified by a man who was arrested for obstructing a police investigation. They are being targeted by a radical agenda that wants to defund the police and let criminals run wild in our streets. We will not stand by and let our department be dismantled by a group of professional agitators. We will fight this with everything we have." The media campaign was brutally effective. Local news channels, always eager for a conflict, ran the sound bites on a loop. The city's conservative newspaper published an editorial praising Chief Morrison's strong leadership and warning against the dangers of mob rule online. Anonymous accounts began to spread misinformation, twisting Richard's words, misrepresenting the goals of the community group, and painting him as a dangerous extremist who hated the police. The pressure began to mount. Some of the more timid supporters from the town hall began to back away, intimidated by the ferocity of the police response. Richard received angry emails. A brick was thrown through the window of the community garden's tool shed, a clear act of intimidation. Richard and Evelyn had anticipated this. They knew that the system would not surrender its power without a fight. This is the classic playbook, Evelyn explained during a late-night strategy session in her office. Step 1. Frame the reformers as radical and dangerous. Step 2. Change the subject from accountability to crime rates. Step 3. Rally the law and order base and scare the moderates. It's predictable, but it's also very effective. Richard, however, was not intimidated. He was a history teacher. He understood the tactics of power. "They're making a mistake," he told Evelyn, a calm certainty in his voice. "They think this is a political debate, a battle of sound bites. They're trying to make it about me versus them, but they're misreading the room." He began to organize his counteroffensive. He didn't engage in a war of words with the chief. Instead, he and his growing group of volunteers, now calling themselves the Oak Ridge Coalition for Community Accountability, OCCA, went door to door. They didn't talk about defunding the police. They talked about Sarah Jenkins's son and his backpack emptied in the rain. They talked about the unanswered complaint forms. They talked about the need for a system where good cops could be trusted and bad cops could be held accountable. They kept the conversation grounded in the real-world experiences of their neighbors. They also started gathering data. Volunteers began combing through years of public records, filing information requests, and building a database of citizen complaints and the department's disposition for each one. A pattern began to emerge. A staggering number of complaints, particularly against a small group of officers, were consistently dismissed as unfounded or exonerated with little to no explanation. While Chief Morrison was fighting a public relations war on television, Richard Allen was quietly building an army on the ground, armed not with rhetoric, but with facts. Morrison and the police union had the bigger microphone, but Richard had the more powerful story. The empire had struck back, but the rebellion was just beginning to find its strength. The city was being divided into two camps, and the battle for its soul had just begun. The public relations war was a stalemate. Chief Morrison controlled the airwaves, successfully framing the debate around officer safety and rising crime. Richard controlled the ground, building a grassroots movement rooted in personal stories and a growing sense of shared frustration. But Richard knew that stories and sentiment alone wouldn't change the system. To defeat an entrenched bureaucracy, you needed more than a movement. You needed a weapon. That weapon would be the law itself. The goal was to move beyond abstract demands for accountability and to create a concrete, legally sound proposal that could be presented to the city council. The lawsuit against the city, still pending, was the stick. This new legislative proposal would be the carrot, a detailed, well-researched roadmap for reform that the city could either adopt willingly or be forced to confront in court. Richard knew he couldn't do this alone. He was an organizer and a historian, not a lawyer or a criminologist. He needed experts. He began to assemble a small, dedicated task force, an unlikely coalition of minds brought together by a shared belief that a better system was possible. His first call was to Evelyn Reed, who brought her sharp legal mind and 2 decades of experience fighting the city. Her role was to ensure that every proposal was legally ironclad, able to withstand the inevitable court challenges from the police union. Next, he recruited Dr. Anya Sharma, a criminology professor from the local university. Dr. Sharma was a woman in her 40s with a passion for data-driven policy. She had spent her career studying police departments across the country, analyzing what worked and what didn't. She brought a wealth of empirical evidence to the table, cutting through the emotional rhetoric with hard facts. She introduced concepts like civilian complaint review boards, CCRBS, from other cities, providing data on their effectiveness in reducing misconduct. The most surprising addition to the team was David Chin, a retired OPD captain, Chen was a 30-year veteran of the force, a quiet, thoughtful man who had become disillusioned with the department's resistance to change in his final years. He had seen the blue wall of silence from the inside. He understood the culture, the training, and the internal politics. He was their inside man, a bridge to the world they were trying to change. He provided invaluable insight into which reforms were practical and which were merely idealistic, and how to frame them in a way that might appeal to the rank-and-file officers who felt let down by their own leadership. This small group began meeting in the evenings in the back room of the public library, poring over policing statutes from other states, academic studies, and the mountain of OPD data the OCCA volunteers had been compiling. The work was painstaking, a methodical process of deconstructing the old system and designing a new one. They broke the problem down into 3 key areas. First was transparency. Dr. Sharma proposed the creation of a public-facing online database that would track all citizen complaints, from filing to final disposition. Names would be redacted, but the nature of the complaint, the officer's badge number, and the outcome of the investigation would be publicly accessible. Sunlight, she argued, is the best disinfectant. Second was oversight. This was the centerpiece of their proposal. They designed a new, fully independent civilian oversight board. Unlike the city's current toothless advisory committee, this board would have real power. It would be comprised of 9 civilian members, selected by the city council from a diverse pool of applicants, with no current or former ties to law enforcement. The board would have the authority to conduct its own independent investigations into serious allegations of misconduct, the power to subpoena officers and evidence, and the ability to recommend disciplinary action directly to the chief, recommendations the chief would have to accept or publicly justify. In writing, his refusal to do so. Third was accountability. This was Captain Chen's area of expertise. He focused on revising the department's use of force matrix, emphasizing de-escalation as the primary tactic. He also proposed an early intervention system, a data-driven program that would flag officers who accumulated multiple complaints, use of force incidents, or were involved in multiple lawsuits. These flagged officers wouldn't be punished initially, but would be required to undergo retraining and counseling. Most cops are good cops, Chen insisted, but the department does a terrible job of catching the ones who are struggling before they become liabilities. This system helps the officer and protects the public. Over the course of a month, these ideas were refined, debated, and drafted into a single, comprehensive piece of legislation they named the Community Safety and Accountability Act. It wasn't a radical, anti-police screed. It was a serious, sober, and evidence-based proposal for reform. It was designed not to defund or dismantle the police, but to make them better, more transparent, and more worthy of the community's trust. When the draft was complete, Richard held it in his hands. It was just a stack of paper, 30 pages of dense legal and procedural language, but it felt heavier. It was the culmination of his pain, his community's frustration, and his team's expertise. It was no longer just a reaction to his wrongful arrest. It was a proactive vision for a better future. They had forged their sword. Now, they had to wield it. The next step was to take this document from the quiet back room of the library and bring it into the Lion's Den, the Oak Ridge City Council. Presenting the Community Safety and Accountability Act to the Oak Ridge City Council was like placing a lit stick of dynamite on a banquet table. The 9-member council, a fractious group of local politicians more accustomed to debating zoning variances and road repair budgets, was suddenly thrust into the center of the most contentious issue the city had faced in a generation. The proposal was formally introduced by Councilwoman Ramirez, a young, progressive member who saw the act as a historic opportunity for change. This forced the council to schedule a public hearing, creating a formal arena for the two sides to clash. The hearing was held in the city council chambers, a grand, wood-paneled room that was packed to the rafters. On one side sat Richard and his supporters from the OCCA, a diverse cross-section of the community wearing matching blue T-shirts that read, "Accountability Now." On the other side sat a sea of navy blue police uniforms, a formidable showing of force organized by Chief Morrison and the police union. The tension was a thick, palpable entity in the room. Chief Morrison was the first to speak. He strode to the podium with an air of weary authority, casting himself as the voice of reason against a tide of radicalism. He didn't attack the act line by line. Instead, he attacked its core premise. This legislation, while perhaps born from good intentions, is a dangerous and misguided experiment that will put our citizens and our officers at risk, he began, his voice resonating through the chamber. It is based on a false narrative that our police department is fundamentally broken. It is not. We are one of the most professional, highly trained departments in the state. He portrayed the Civilian Oversight Board as an attack on his authority and a form of amateur quarterbacking by people with no understanding of the realities of police work. You cannot have civilians with no training and no experience, second-guessing the split-second life-or-death decisions my officers have to make. This board will create hesitation. It will lead to paralysis, and criminals will be the only ones who benefit. He painted the transparency database as a tool for harassing and doxing good officers, and the early intervention system as a bureaucratic nightmare that would treat cops like potential criminals. His speech was a masterclass in fear-mongering, skillfully designed to appeal to the council's most risk-averse members. He concluded with a stark warning. "If you pass this act," he said, looking directly at the council members, "officer morale will plummet, resignations will skyrocket. Our ability to recruit new officers will be crippled. I cannot be held responsible for the rise in crime that will inevitably follow. The safety of this city is in your hands. Choose wisely." The uniformed officers behind him erupted in thunderous applause. It was a powerful and intimidating display. Then, it was Richard's turn. He walked to the podium not with anger, but with the calm, methodical demeanor of the teacher he once was. He carried a binder, filled with the data his team had compiled. "Chief Morrison speaks of a false narrative," Richard began, his voice clear and strong. "Let's talk about the real narrative. The narrative of the 437 citizen complaints filed against the OPD in the last 3 years. The narrative of the 92% of those complaints that were dismissed internally with no action taken. The narrative of the nearly $2 million in lawsuit settlements this city has paid out over the last 5 years due to officer misconduct. These are not narratives, Mr. Mayor. They are facts. They are the price of a system without accountability." He addressed each of Morrison's points with cool, relentless logic. "The chief fears that a civilian board will second-guess his officers," Richard said. "But oversight is not about second-guessing. It's about ensuring that the first guess is sound, constitutional, and respectful of the citizens you serve. It's the same principle of oversight that applies to every other branch of government. Why should the police be the sole exception?" He projected a chart onto the screen behind him, compiled by Dr. Sharma. He speaks of officer morale. Here is a list of 10 cities that have implemented strong civilian oversight. In 8 of them, officer morale actually increased after 2 years. Why? Because good officers, the vast majority of officers, do not want to work alongside bad ones. A system that effectively weeds out problem officers protects the integrity and the reputation of the entire department. He turned a page in his binder. "The chief calls our transparency proposal a tool for harassment. I call it a tool for building trust. The current system, where complaints disappear into a black hole, breeds suspicion and resentment. When you operate in secret, you invite the community to assume the worst. When you operate in the open, you show them you have nothing to hide. Trust cannot be demanded. It must be earned. For 20 minutes, Richard dismantled the chief's arguments, not with rhetoric, but with evidence. He wasn't the angry radical Morrison had tried to portray. He was the most prepared, most reasonable person in the room. He spoke not as an enemy of the police, but as a citizen demanding that a public institution be accountable to the public it serves. He finished by looking not at the council, but at the officers in the room. "I know that most of you wear your badge with honor," he said, his voice softening. "This act is not an indictment of you. It is a tool to help you. It will restore the community's faith in your work. It will give you a department whose integrity is beyond question. We are not asking you to be perfect. We are asking for a system that is honest and accountable when you are not. That is a standard we should all be able to support." When he finished, the silence in the room was profound. Then, the side of the chamber filled with his supporters rose to their feet, their applause even more deafening than that for the chief. It was a standing ovation, not just for a speech, but for a principle. The battle lines had been clearly drawn. It was Morrison's fear versus Richard's facts. It was the old guard versus the new. And the 9 men and women on the city council were now caught squarely in the middle, forced to choose which vision of Oak Ridge they would endorse. The city council hearing created a political deadlock. The council was split. 4 members, led by Councilwoman Ramirez, were staunchly in favor of the Accountability Act. 4 conservative members were firmly aligned with Chief Morrison and the police union, echoing their fears about hamstringing the police. The deciding vote belonged to the council's veteran swing voter, a pragmatic, business-minded man named Arthur Vance. Vance was cautious, deeply concerned with the city's budget and potential legal liabilities. He was swayed by Richard's logic, but spooked by Morrison's dire warnings. The fate of the act hung on his decision. Richard and the OCCA knew they needed something to break the stalemate. They needed to prove their central thesis, that the problem wasn't just a few isolated incidents, but a systemic pattern of misconduct being actively concealed by the department's leadership. The data they had presented was compelling, but it was abstract. They needed a smoking gun. That smoking gun came from an unexpected source. A local investigative reporter named Jenna Casey, who had been covering the story for the city's independent weekly paper, had been inspired by the OCCA's work. Using the list of anonymous complaint numbers from Richard's database, she began filing aggressive Freedom of Information Act requests, specifically targeting the internal affairs files of the officers with the most complaints. The city stonewalled, citing privacy concerns and ongoing investigations. But Casey was relentless, and with legal backing from a pro bono press freedom group. She began to pry open the lid on the department's secrets. Her breakthrough came when a source from within the police department, a disillusioned clerk in the Internal Affairs Division, tired of watching legitimate complaints get buried, leaked a series of unredacted case files. The files were a bombshell. They focused on 3 officers, Kincaid, Wallace, and, to a lesser extent, Young. But the real story wasn't just about them. It was about the pattern of how their misconduct was handled. The files revealed that Officer Kincaid, in his short 4-year career, had amassed 9 citizen complaints prior to his encounter with Richard. They ranged from illegal searches to verbal abuse to 2 separate excessive force allegations. In every single case, the investigation had been conducted internally, and in every single case, Kincaid had been cleared. The investigative summaries were cursory, often relying solely on the testimony of Kincaid and his partner, Officer Wallace, while dismissing civilian testimony as unreliable or biased. But the most damning revelation was what the files called an informal supervisory intervention. Done 2 years prior, after Kincaid was accused of breaking a suspect's wrist during an arrest for disorderly conduct, the charge was later dropped. His supervising sergeant wrote a blistering confidential memo to then-Captain Michael Morrison. The memo described Kincaid as having a hair-trigger temper and an inability to de-escalate. The sergeant explicitly warned that Kincaid was a lawsuit waiting to happen and recommended he be reassigned to a desk job and undergo mandatory anger management counseling. The leaked documents included Morrison's signed response. He had overruled the sergeant's recommendation instead of disciplinary action. Morrison had ordered a simple counseling session and noted in the file that Kincaid was a proactive officer who simply needed to refine his command presence. He had not only ignored the warning, he had actively protected a problem officer. He had chosen to protect one of his own over protecting the public. Jenna Casey's story, published on the front page of the weekly paper under the headline, "The Kincaid Files, a Pattern of Misconduct and Cover-Up," was an explosion. It was no longer Richard Allen's word against the department's. It was the department's own internal records, exposing a clear and undeniable conspiracy to hide the misconduct of a dangerous officer. And the cover-up went all the way to the top, directly to the desk of Chief Michael Morrison. The story proved everything Richard had been saying. The thin blue line wasn't just about solidarity. It was about a wall of silence that protected problem officers and endangered the public. The internal complaint system wasn't a tool for accountability. It was a laundry machine for official misconduct. The political fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Morrison. The narrative he had so carefully crafted of a professional department under attack by radicals was shattered. He was no longer the steady leader protecting his city. He was a bureaucrat who had ignored explicit warnings and allowed a known problem to fester within his ranks, directly leading to the wrongful arrest of a respected citizen. The 4 council members who had supported him were suddenly silent, their staunch defense of the department now looking like complicity. The media, which had once given him a platform, now hounded him with questions about the cover-up. At his next press conference, he was visibly shaken, his usual confident bluster replaced by defensive, evasive answers. For Arthur Vance, the cautious swing voter, the decision was no longer difficult. The Kincaid files had given him all the evidence he needed. The risk of passing the Accountability Act was now dwarfed by the clear and present liability of maintaining the status quo. The systemic rot was no longer a theory. It was a documented fact. The skeletons were out of the closet, and they were pointing directly at the chief's office. The political deadlock was about to be broken. The publication of the Kincaid Files was the political equivalent of a dam breaking. The steady pressure Richard and the OCCA had been applying for weeks was suddenly transformed into a torrential, unstoppable flood of public outrage. The story validated every fear and confirmed every suspicion that had been voiced in the church basement. It was no longer about one wrongful arrest. It was about a culture of impunity, sanctioned from the very top. The city council, which had been paralyzed by a 4-4-1 split, was now a flurry of frantic activity. The 4 members who had backed Chief Morrison scrambled to distance themselves, issuing vague statements about the need for thorough investigations and rebuilding trust. Their political alliance with the chief had become toxic overnight. The key figure in this new landscape was Arthur Vance. He had been the fulcrum of the debate, the man whose indecision had held the entire process in limbo. He was a fiscal conservative, a man who believed in small government and balanced budgets. His initial reluctance to support the act was rooted in a genuine fear of creating a new, expensive bureaucracy, the Civilian Oversight Board, and opening the city up to even more lawsuits by admitting fault. Jenna Casey's article completely inverted his political calculus. Vance realized that not passing the act was now the fiscally irresponsible position. The leaked files demonstrated a clear pattern of negligence that was legally indefensible. The pending lawsuit from Richard was already a major liability. The potential for future lawsuits from the other victims in Kincaid's files was staggering. The cost of maintaining the status quo, of continuing to pay settlements for the misconduct of officers the department knew were problems, was infinitely higher than the cost of implementing a new system of oversight. The cover-up wasn't just a moral failure. It was a financial time bomb. 2 days after the story broke, Vance requested a private meeting with Richard Allen. They met not in City Hall, but in a quiet coffee shop, away from the prying eyes of the media and political operatives. Vance, a man in his 60s with a weary but sharp intelligence, got straight to the point. "Mr. Allen," he began, stirring his coffee slowly, "I owe you an apology. I was skeptical. I viewed your proposal through the lens of risk and expenditure. I failed to see the much larger risk of inaction." Richard simply nodded, allowing the councilman to speak. "This is no longer about whether we need reform," Vance continued, looking Richard directly in the eye. "Chief Morrison's credibility is shot. He either knew about this pattern and covered it up, or he was so incompetent he didn't see it happening right under his nose. Either way, he has proven with his own actions that the department cannot be trusted to police itself. Your case for independent civilian oversight is no longer debatable. It's essential." He took a sip of his coffee. "I am going to publicly announce my full support for the Community Safety and Accountability Act. Furthermore, I am going to propose an amendment to fund the new Civilian Oversight Board not with new taxes, but by reallocating funds from the police department's bloated administrative and public relations budget. We're going to pay for the cure by cutting funding to the disease." It was a stunning reversal. Vance wasn't just capitulating. He was becoming a champion of the cause. By framing the funding in that way, he was not only making it more palatable to his fellow fiscal conservatives, but he was also delivering a sharp, public rebuke to Chief Morrison's leadership. "I will need your help," Vance added. "The union will fight this tooth and nail. They'll call me a traitor. They'll try to intimidate other council members. We need to keep the public pressure on. We need to show that this is not a fringe movement, but the will of the people of Oak Ridge." Richard felt a profound sense of vindication, but also a new weight of responsibility. "You'll have it," he promised. "The people of this city are ready for a change." Vance's public declaration, made the next day on the steps of City Hall, was the moment the tide officially turned. With his vote secured, the act now had a 5-4 majority. The 4 conservative members who had sided with the police were left isolated and politically exposed. Chief Morrison and the union were suddenly on the defensive. Their power to intimidate the council severely diminished. The news spread like wildfire through the OCCA. A celebration erupted at their makeshift headquarters. But Richard reminded them that the fight wasn't over. "This is a major victory," he told his volunteers, "but it's not the final one. They will try every trick in the book to delay, to amend, to water down this legislation before the final vote. We have the momentum. Now we have to use it to carry this across the finish line." The political landscape of Oak Ridge had been permanently altered. The cautious, pragmatic center had moved. Arthur Vance's conversion, driven by the undeniable facts of the Kincaid files, had transformed the Accountability Act from a controversial proposal into an inevitability. The question was no longer if reform would come to Oak Ridge, but when and in what form. With a clear majority now in place, the path to passing the Accountability Act seemed clear. But the old guard, cornered and desperate, was not going to surrender without a final, bitter fight. In the week leading up to the final vote, Chief Morrison and the police union unleashed a last-ditch effort to derail the legislation. They employed a strategy of procedural warfare. Pro-police council members introduced a flurry of last-minute amendments designed to gut the bill of its essential powers. One amendment sought to allow the police chief to have final veto power over any disciplinary recommendation from the Civilian Oversight Board, rendering it toothless. Another tried to exempt all pending internal investigations from the new transparency rules, effectively shielding the Kincaid files and dozens of other cases from public scrutiny. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, an attempt to pass a reform bill that changed nothing at all. This was where the OCCA's grassroots organization became crucial. Richard and his team mobilized their supporters. They launched a massive phone and email campaign, flooding the offices of the council members with messages from their constituents demanding they pass the act without any weakening amendments. On the day of the vote, they organized a silent vigil outside City Hall. Hundreds of citizens stood in the plaza, holding candles and signs with the names of people who had been victims of police misconduct. It was a powerful, quiet display of public will that provided a visible backbone to the wavering council members inside. The final council meeting was the most dramatic in the city's recent history. The chamber was overflowing, with spectators spilling into the hallways where TV monitors had been set up. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The debate over the amendments was fierce. The council's conservative bloc argued that they were common-sense compromises, while Ramirez and her allies, armed with talking points from Richard and Evelyn, exposed them as poison pills, one by one, with Arthur Vance holding firm with the reform-minded members. The weakening amendments were voted down. The act was going to be voted on in its original, powerful form. Before the final vote, each council member was given 5 minutes to speak. It was the moment for grandstanding, for final pleas, and for history. The 4 opposition members gave grim speeches, predicting chaos and a city overrun by crime. Councilwoman Ramirez spoke passionately about a new era of trust and partnership between the police and the community. Then Arthur Vance, the man who had been the key, took the floor. He didn't speak to his colleagues. He spoke directly to Chief Morrison, who sat stony-faced in the front row. "Chief," Vance said, his voice quiet but carrying across the silent chamber, "for years, this council has given you everything you've asked for. Bigger budgets, more officers, new equipment. We trusted you. We trusted your leadership. And that trust, we now know, was betrayed. You told us you had a professional department, but your own records show you protected problem officers. You told us that civilian oversight was unnecessary, but your actions have proven it is essential. This bill is not the cause of a crisis. Chief, it is the necessary response to one, a crisis of your own making." It was a stunning public rebuke that left Morrison visibly shaken. Finally, it was time for the vote. The city clerk called the roll. Councilwoman Ramirez, aye. Councilman Davies, nay. Councilman Schmidt, nay. Councilwoman Chen, aye. Councilman Miller, nay. Councilman Washington, aye. Councilwoman Patel, aye. Councilman O'Malley, nay. The vote was tied, 4-4. The entire room held its breath. The fate of the city's future rested, as it had for weeks, with one man. "Councilman Vance?" Arthur Vance looked out across the chamber, his gaze lingering for a moment on the hundreds of hopeful faces, and then on Richard Allen. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Aye," he said, his voice firm and clear. The word detonated in the room. A wave of raw emotion, cheers, applause, tears of joy swept through the chamber. The OCCA supporters leaped to their feet, hugging and crying. Richard Allen stood amidst the celebration, a quiet, profound sense of victory washing over him. It was done. The impossible had been achieved. He had been arrested on a sunlit street, humiliated and stripped of his rights. He had been offered millions to make it go away. He had refused. He had chosen the harder path. He had endured slander and intimidation. He had organized, educated, and fought. And now, in the highest hall of power in his city, he had won. The Community Safety and Accountability Act was now the law of the land in Oak Ridge. The city would have a new civilian oversight board, a new transparent complaint system, and a new use of force policy. Amid the celebration, Richard's eyes met those of Chief Morrison across the room. The chief's face was a mask of cold fury and defeat. He knew, and Richard knew, that this vote was not just the passage of a law. It was the end of an era. Morrison's power, his authority, and his career had been broken. The system he had so fiercely protected had been fundamentally and irrevocably changed. Not by a politician, not by a lawsuit, but by the quiet, unyielding resolve of a history teacher he had mistaken for a common criminal. The passage of the Community Safety and Accountability Act was a political earthquake, but the aftershocks were just beginning. The new law was not merely symbolic. It was a functioning piece of machinery designed to exact accountability, and its gears began to turn almost immediately. The first order of business was the formation of the new 9-member Civilian Oversight Board, COB. The City Council, under intense public scrutiny, appointed a remarkably diverse and qualified group. It included a retired judge, a social worker, a law professor, a local business owner, and, in a move of particular significance, Sarah Jenkins, the woman whose story of her son's humiliating traffic stop had been one of the first and most powerful testimonies at the initial town hall meeting. They were serious, independent-minded citizens, not political cronies, and they took their new mandate seriously. Their very first act, once they were sworn in, was to vote unanimously to open a formal investigation into the handling of the Richard Allen arrest and the subsequent revelations from the Kincaid files. It was a direct, public challenge to Chief Morrison's authority. Morrison, legally obligated by the new law to cooperate, was caught in a vice. He was forced to turn over the complete, unredacted internal affairs files for Kincaid, Wallace, and Young, along with years of internal memos and emails related to the IA process. For the first time, the department's secrets were being examined not by their own, but by a panel of outsiders with the power to subpoena and compel testimony. The COB held public, televised hearings. They called Officer Kincaid to testify. Under sharp questioning from the retired judge, Kincaid's arrogant demeanor crumbled. Stripped of the protection of his chief and the Union, he became a sullen, defensive figure, unable to logically justify his actions on the day of Richard's arrest. He was followed by Officer Young, who, with the promise of immunity from prosecution, broke the blue wall of silence. Young testified that there had been no suspicious person call, and that the confrontation was initiated by Kincaid based solely on a gut feeling. He admitted under oath that he knew the arrest was wrong, but was afraid to challenge a senior officer. The most dramatic testimony came from the sergeant who had written the original warning memo about Kincaid. He detailed how his concerns were dismissed by then-Captain Morrison and how he was later subtly punished for speaking out. Transferred to a less desirable post, the investigation methodically peeled back the layers of deception, revealing a culture of cronyism and cover-up that permeated the department's command staff. It became clear that Morrison's leadership was defined not by a commitment to public safety, but by a fierce, almost tribal loyalty to his own officers, regardless of their conduct. The final witness was Chief Michael Morrison himself. He strode into the hearing room with a flicker of his old confidence, prepared to defend his record. But the board was armed with his own emails, his own memos, his own signed orders. They confronted him with the sergeant's warning. They asked him why he had overruled it. They asked him why Kincaid had been allowed to remain on the street. His answers were a tangle of bureaucratic doublespeak and evasions. I have to trust my commanders. We have to consider officer morale. Hindsight is always 20/20. He deflected. He obfuscated, but he could not escape the damning paper trail. He had personally enabled a dangerous officer, and his negligence had led directly to a crisis that had cost the city millions and shattered the community's trust. 3 weeks later, the Civilian Oversight Board released its first official report. It was a scathing 100-page indictment of Morrison's leadership. The report concluded that the chief had presided over a catastrophically failed internal disciplinary system and had demonstrated a reckless disregard for his duty to protect the public from known problem officers. The board formally recommended that the mayor and city council terminate his employment for cause. The political pressure was immense. The city's newspapers called for his resignation on their editorial pages. The police union, seeing him as a liability, offered only a lukewarm defense. His support on the city council had completely evaporated. Morrison was an emperor with no clothes. His power and influence stripped away by the very system of accountability he had fought so hard to prevent. He was given a choice: be fired in a public spectacle, or resign. A week after the report was released, a humbled and defeated Michael Morrison stood before a bank of news cameras for the last time. He announced his immediate retirement, effective at the end of the week. He spoke of his love for the city and his pride in the department's officers, never once admitting fault or taking responsibility. He was a man going into exile, still clinging to the tattered remnants of his own mythology. The fall of the old guard was complete. Officer Kincaid and Officer Wallace were fired by the department shortly after their testimony. The system Richard had set in motion was working. It was painful. It was messy. But it was purging the rot that had festered for so long. The city of Oak Ridge was now facing a profound power vacuum. The police department was in disarray, its leadership disgraced, its morale at an all-time low. The community was hopeful, but anxious. They had torn down the old, corrupt structure, but now someone had to build a new one. The city was in desperate need of a leader, someone with the integrity, the vision, and the public trust to clean up the mess. And in the chaotic aftermath of Morrison's departure, all eyes began to turn in a very unexpected direction. The resignation of Chief Morrison left a gaping wound at the heart of Oak Ridge's civic life. The police department, leaderless and demoralized, was adrift. The rank-and-file officers, many of whom were good people who had been let down by their leadership, were caught between a public that distrusted them and a command structure that was in shambles. The city was at a dangerous crossroads. It could descend into further division and chaos, or it could seize this moment as a once-in-a-generation opportunity for real, foundational change. The mayor and the city council were in a panic. They needed to appoint an interim police chief immediately, someone who could stabilize the department, begin the healing process, and oversee the implementation of the new Accountability Act. The problem was, who could possibly fill that role? Appointing a deputy chief from within the department was a non-starter. The COB's report had implicated the entire command staff in the culture of cover-up. Promoting from within would be seen as a continuation of the old regime. Bringing in an outsider, a chief from another city, was an option. But it would take time, and they would lack the local knowledge and the trust of the community. The city needed someone with unimpeachable integrity, someone who understood the need for reform because they had lived it, someone who was respected not just by the politicians, but by the people in the neighborhoods, someone who could bridge the enormous gap between the community and the police. The idea started as a whisper. A wild and seemingly absurd suggestion floated in an online community forum. Then it was picked up by an alternative newspaper. Then a local radio host mentioned it on his morning show. Within days, the whisper had become a roar. What if the person to lead the police department out of the darkness was the very man who had exposed it? What if the interim chief of police was Richard Allen? At first, Richard dismissed the idea as ludicrous. He was a teacher, an activist, not a cop. He had no law enforcement experience. The thought of him sitting in Michael Morrison's chair was laughable. But the movement began to take on a life of its own. It was a perfect, almost poetic solution to the city's crisis. Who better to enforce accountability than the man who had written the law on it? Who better to rebuild trust than the man who had the absolute trust of the community? A draft Richard Allen for Chief campaign began, started by the same volunteers from the OCCA. Petitions began to circulate, lawn signs appeared overnight. The idea, which had seemed so radical at first, began to feel like the only logical solution. The city council, desperate for a way out of their predicament, began to take the idea seriously. Councilwoman Ramirez was the first to publicly endorse it. Then, surprisingly, Arthur Vance signed on. "We need a radical break from the past," he argued in a council meeting. "We don't need another bureaucrat. We need a visionary. Richard Allen has proven he is a leader of incredible skill and integrity. He is the only person who can begin the process of healing this city." A delegation from the city council, led by Vance and Ramirez, formally requested a meeting with Richard. They met in the same church basement where the movement had begun. "Richard," Vance began, "the city is in crisis. We need a leader for the police department who has the unqualified trust of the public. We need someone to oversee the full and faithful implementation of the act you helped create. The council has discussed this at length. We believe that person is you. We would like to offer you the position of interim chief of police." Richard was stunned into silence. The sheer, staggering irony of it was almost too much to comprehend. The city wanted to hand the keys to the kingdom to the man they had thrown in a cage just a few months earlier. "Councilman," Richard finally said, his voice strained, "I appreciate the confidence, but I am not a police officer. I don't know how to run a police department." "You don't have to," Ramirez countered. "You're not being asked to be a beat cop. You're being asked to be a leader, a policy setter, a culture changer. You can appoint an experienced, reform-minded veteran as your deputy to handle the day-to-day operations. Your job would be to set the new standard, to hold the department accountable, to be the bridge to the community. Your primary qualification is not law enforcement experience. It's the moral authority you have earned. No one else has it." He spent the next 2 days in deep contemplation. He talked to his family, to Evelyn Reed, to Captain Chen, to the members of the OCCA. The responsibility was terrifying. The police union would be apoplectic. The entrenched old guard within the department would try to undermine him at every turn. It was a Herculean, perhaps impossible task. But then he thought about the alternative. If he said no, the council would likely appoint a safe, uninspired bureaucrat who would pay lip service to reform while changing nothing of substance. The incredible hard-won victory of the Accountability Act could wither on the vine, killed by 1,000 small acts of passive resistance from within the department. This was his chance, the city's chance, to ensure the law was not just a piece of paper, but a living, breathing reality. It was a chance to finish what he had started. He remembered the promise he had made to himself in that holding cell, to change the system. He had never imagined it would mean this, but sometimes, to truly change a system, you had to be willing to lead it. On the third day, he called the mayor's office. He had made his decision. The swearing-in ceremony was held on the steps of City Hall, the same place where Chief Morrison had once stood and denounced Richard as a radical. The crowd that gathered was not the usual collection of political insiders and media. It was the city. It was Mrs. Gable from Maple Avenue, the Johnson brothers, Sarah Jenkins and her son, the volunteers from the OCCA, and hundreds of other ordinary citizens who had been swept up in this extraordinary civic journey. Richard Allen stood before them, his right hand raised, not in a suit, but in a simple dark sport coat and slacks. He was not a politician. and he would not pretend to be one. He placed his left hand on a Bible held by his wife and recited the oath of office, his voice steady and clear. When the judge finished, he turned to the crowd and said, "I, Richard Allen, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of Interim Chief of Police for the city of Oak Ridge." The applause was heartfelt and sustained. It was not just for him, but for the improbable journey they had all taken together. In his speech, he didn't talk about crime rates or enforcement strategies. He talked about trust, dignity, and service. He announced that his first act as chief would be to hold listening sessions in every neighborhood in the city. "For too long," he said, "the police have talked at the community. It's time for us to listen." He announced his appointment of the retired Captain David Chen as his deputy chief of operations, a move that sent a clear signal that he valued experience but demanded a commitment to reform. After the ceremony, he walked from City Hall to police headquarters. As he entered the building, a place he had last seen in handcuffs, a hush fell over the lobby. Officers at their desks stopped their work and looked up, their faces a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and outright hostility. He was the enemy, the man who had brought their world crashing down, and he was now their boss. He walked straight to the chief's office on the top floor. The nameplate on the door still read, "Michael Morrison." Richard paused, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. The office was large and imposing, dominated by a massive mahogany desk and a wall of plaques and commendations. It was a shrine to the old way of doing things. He walked behind the desk and looked out the large window at the city spread below him. His city. His responsibility. The journey that had begun with a humiliating injustice on a sunlit street had brought him here, to the very center of power. He had not sought it. He had not wanted it. But he had accepted it. He picked up the phone on the desk and buzzed his new secretary. "Yes. Chief?" A tentative voice answered. "Please have someone from maintenance come up here," Richard said calmly. "I need this nameplate on the door changed, and I'd like all these plaques taken down. We're going to need the wall space. I plan on putting up a new mission statement for this department, one that we're going to write together, with the community." He hung up the phone and sat down in the large leather chair. It felt foreign, too large, but he knew he would grow into it. The fight to change the system from the outside was over. The much harder, much longer fight to rebuild it from the inside had just begun. The so-called SUV thief now held the keys, and he was ready to get to work. In the quiet moments after a storm, reflection offers a clarity that the chaos itself can never provide. Looking back, what drove Officer Kincaid that day? It wasn't simple malice. It was a potent, toxic cocktail of insecurity and institutional arrogance. He was a young man armed with the immense power of the state, but perhaps lacked a core of personal confidence. Richard Allen's calm, intelligent refusal to be intimidated was not perceived as the action of a law-abiding citizen, but as a direct challenge to his authority, a threat to his fragile sense of control. His badge was not a symbol of public trust. It was armor for his ego. Had Kincaid's training emphasized empathy and de-escalation as much as it did threat assessment and control, he might have seen a community leader, not a suspect. He might have become an ally instead of an antagonist. And what of Richard? What if he had let his righteous anger boil over? Had he shouted, argued, or made a single sudden move? The entire narrative would have shifted. Kincaid's report would have been validated. He would have been just another belligerent suspect. What if he had simply taken the multi-million-dollar settlement? He would have been wealthy, his personal wrong righted, but the systemic rot would have remained, waiting for its next victim. His victory was born not from defiance, but from discipline. His power came not from fighting the system on its own aggressive terms, but by holding fast to his own principles of logic, community, and unwavering integrity. He demonstrated that true strength isn't the power to dominate, but the resolve to endure and transform. This story is a testament to the fact that the most powerful response to injustice is not always vengeance, but a relentless and strategic pursuit of reform. It reminds us that a single individual, armed with the truth and the support of their community, can dismantle a corrupt power structure and rebuild it into something better. It shows us that sometimes the person best equipped to fix a broken system is the one who has felt its brokenness most acutely. What do you think is the most critical element for ensuring police accountability in a community? Have you ever seen a situation where one person's principled stand made a significant difference? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And please support our channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.